reaching that time, and we're about to embark on our examination. The whole idea is to present information. Hopefully, that'll stimulate some discussion. The idea would be to enable that free-flowing discussion, and so that if there's now a lot of what you're going to hear is probably history that somehow got edited out of the human story, and I wouldn't have came across it unless there was other professors and other people who were taking the time to say, think about this, or let's consider these areas. A lot of the work that kind of put me on this trail was a larger discussion about values and why they're so important to group organization. And this is a lot of this work. Early work was by Bruce Morito, Professor Bruce Morito. He's an environmental philosopher. He's up in northern BC, teaching up there. Anyways, if you hang around often enough, we'll start off with a song. This is Wanda Skeed's song. It's a woman's song, and I'm picking it only because of the. Well, it just seems appropriate. Now, I might mess up on a couple of notes. I'll give you a warning on that. You can tell it's a woman's song because some of those notes in there are really super high. But if I could get everybody to stand at this point. Everybody can sit. It's not trying to show my manners and some of my personal commitments. My first shout out goes to my wife. She's stubborn like me. You may not think I'm stubborn, but believe me. And I met my match. So it's kind of like, but she is very on point, very critical. She's a voracious reader, and she's totally 100% committed to providing a more correct story about humanity and the many diverse groups that make up this family. So, and she's very aware about a lot of the stories of origins. If we look into Ronald Wright's writings, The Short History of Progress, he spends a significant amount of time talking about that the longevity of groups is often tied to how well they can answer these three questions that you see up on the board. Where do we come from? What are we? and where are we going? And there's three childlike, he calls them childlike questions. But when you start to put that against the backdrop of how long and how complicated the human story is, then those questions take on quite a bit of meaning. There's been ages of violence trying to end up as the authority and the group that's able to tell where we come from. There's a tremendous amount of power and authority awarded to that group and has been awarded to that group all the way through history. I didn't have time to include it into today's work, but at one time Christianity was not only the keepers of science, and Galileo found that out pretty quick because they're going to chop his head off because he was bumping up against their authority. Science was starting to come out and start to claim being the author of how the world is organized and how the universe is organized. And they pretty much said, Galileo, you don't get that. That's ours. And if you're going to keep arguing with us, we're going to chop your head off. And that's going to be the end of it. And so, but just then and there, they weren't only trying to be the custodians of science, they were also the custodians of government. They were also at one time military. They were also spiritual. And when you start to put those powers into one central group, that is a tremendous amount of influence. And it's not just a 1 year or 2 year, that you're talking about an influence that was able to sustain itself over centuries of existence. And so it was able to influence all that history that was happening in all that time. Going to church at one point 5, 6, 7 times a day, that was considered normal. And if you didn't go to church, well, you're going to be put on someone's book as some kind of questionable type of person. So there was a lot of pressure to be conformed to those kinds of expectations. And so we're going to keep circling back to that particular theme. That theme is pretty much interwoven into many of the other areas that we'll try and examine later on today. What are we? Again, you're going back to the story of creation. And you've got Adam and Eve, and you've got, but there's similarities. When you look at the Anishinaabe teachings, you'll start to see similarities where Christianity says we come from the earth. Well, Anishinaabe teaches, yeah, we come from the earth. We were created from the earth. And Christianity will also say we went and named creation. And Anishinaabe people say, yeah, we did too. We went out and named everything. There starts to be a departure at the point when you start to say, Anishinaabe people go on to say that it was creation that named us. Once we finished all that journey of naming everything, we were the human was standing there saying, I don't have a name. I don't really know where I belong. I don't know how I fit into this bigger story of creation. And that's when the animal kingdom came forward and said, we'll name you. We'll give you a name so that you have a place, that you know that you belong, your identity, all those really essential human types of things are possible with you. So again, where are we going? I think that as I agree with Mr. Wright's writings, that if we get a chance to answer those first two correctly, those first two questions, then we'll have a better shot at trying to answer the third one. Where it is are we going? Where do we want to go? Where do we feel that we should be trying to go? So anyways, I could get stuck on this. I just love this stuff. Anyways, we're talking about worldviews. Now, nobody woke up this morning and said, I think I'm going to think about my worldview today. And nobody's drinking their coffee, it is. I really enjoy my worldview. That just doesn't happen. It's something you have to be able to take time and stop before you rush out the door to get on the bus, and before you you do all these other things you're being asked to do or expected to do. Very few people get the chance to talk about worldviews. Never mind how worldviews were constructed. We're going to give a quick attempt like that. Economic ideologies, another one. Nobody woke up thinking, well, I'm going to talk about economic ideologies. Those conversations are very rare. However, the two exist in the same society. And people just, well, I never really had an idea about that, that those two concepts are closely interwoven in such a way as that they interpret my reality that I find myself in when I get a chance to think about my reality. So anyways, this is, again, I'm going to have someone echo in the back. Move on, Eric. Because I keep getting bogged down in my anyways, I try not to make this really too informational heavy, and I mean written, because I know I'm flapping my lips up here and people got text there and you're trying to do both, and if you're like me, you can only do one thing at a time, which is a pretty successful day if I can do that. But anyways, in this training you are going to be asked to acknowledge your personal bias. Everybody's got a personal bias. We got certain commitments to certain ideas. There was a group out there that thought the world was flat. And yeah, they were willing to go to great lengths to prove that they were right. Well, it didn't turn out that way. This presentation is intended to get at the deeply held ideas that has and is powering the world's organization as we know it, as we experience it. This presentation will do this by examining the mental experience in humanity's history as a whole. It will do this by linking centuries of history to the worldview most Canadians, there should be an S on there, have inherited from colonial origins and by colonial historians. It will do this by attempting to provide an alternative explanation that reinterprets how the human experience is linked to the questions, where do we come from, what are we, where are we going? Examining worldviews involves reviewing a variety of histories and psychology, land use, religions, science, political, economic ideologies, war, law. You could kind of go on and on and on. There's only one discipline that works with all these knowledges. This discipline is philosophy. And so I started out, this is a deeply philosophical examination. This is my attempt at some humor. Let's begin with a philosophical question. Who am I? Why are you here? Some of the qualifications I feel that allow me to this opportunity to stand up and talk about this stuff is I got a degree in history. I concentrated in colonial history, so I read through the world in terms of how colonization happened on each continent and what were the ages and the types of displacements and wars and other things that had happened in those different regions. What was the North American experience with colonization? I was able to stay in school long enough to get another diploma in legal office administration. What that did was kind of suit me to being a political examiner, a history of political relationships. I got involved with education nationally. I got then involved with addictions research about, got to really understand the poverty that people must contend with, especially First Nations people, other people who are not part of the core group that's running any one particular country. They have tremendously difficult times and circumstances to contend with. I got involved in land claims, politics, so I guess what I'm trying to say is got a fairly rounded, plus I raised 3 kids by myself, and they don't hand out diplomas for that, but they should, because that is tremendously difficult task. And I, again, to the ladies in the room, I will stand and salute you for all that you've done and all that you do. Again, I'm getting, here we go. How much historical knowledge each individual has will make a big difference to how each person understands the mental experience that is humanity's story. And so I try to include as many people in there as I could, because all of those are histories. I'm going to always include the little Roman fella in the bottom there, because of how much influence that particular age had on everything. Economic and worldviews. I think there's another. Yes. European worldview, as it developed over 1,000 years, has been deeply influenced and powered by values belonging to an economic logic. This logic is responsible for much of what was experienced, and why the big emphasis being placed on worldviews and economic ideology is because of the connection. It had the ability from being able to take the human view on nature and shift it to where man or humanity sees themselves as the center of everything. It's all about what human values are assigning to everything else that's in the reality, within the natural world. And that's creating a certain amount of problems for everybody, and a rising threat to people globally. Okay, you're going to see this guy pop up every once in a while. Again, he's this guy that's in the back of the room. Say, what about this? You know, what about this? I had some clips in here. Somebody's authors put out, but I tried to load it into my PowerPoint and it just would not cooperate. So I missed them. This is the first real one that's going to be a cornerstone to this particular talk. The conformity to inequality is deeply rooted in both an ancient and modern economic social orders. This foundation principle is at the center of all Europe's civilizations and economic models. Its principles and logic have been maintained as a rational societal course and economic arrangement in each century. Rome, and it's the footprint that it left in history. At one point, Germans were tribal people. They were oral societies. Spaniards, or the place called Spain, was tribal. They had oral societies. They had oral or tribal ideas about the human land relationships. Same things with Germans, same thing with Britain, same things with Irish. All of these different places had this type of animistic belief system, that the land had spirits and humanity needed to somehow stay connected with those spirits. So and then the Romans would show up, and we're going to get more into that a little bit later, but it started to change. It started to target these ways of thinking, these ways of viewing the world. All of those views came under attack. I'm going to keep going. This is the idea of inequality was fundamental to the Roman Empire, medieval feudal society, and early colonial life as a social economic order. Understanding why the indigenous worldview was at odds with this economic social order and its logic is extremely important to truth and reconciliation. It is this logic, economic social order, and view on the natural world that framed the relationship between indigenous people, colonists, and the North American nation states. I wanted to circle back a bit to the population of Rome at the time that the Roman Empire was rising, and there was like 60 million people within that empire. 1 in 5 were slaves. On its high point, there was 1 in 3 were slaves. So you're talking about a really major slave market, and this is all tied to the wealth. This is all tied to land and resources. This is all tied to conquering people, and somehow the Romans kind of figured out that they can't stand over everybody with a spear all day long and make them do what they want them to do. So what they had to do was somehow come up with a process in which they could assimilate the people that they were taking the lands away from. And with the promise to say, listen, you do what we're telling you to do. At some point, maybe not right now, maybe 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, but you'll start to get Roman citizen rights. And so a lot of this citizen criteria was you had to display a loyalty to the Roman Empire. You had to start to speak the language of the Roman Empire. You had to enlist in their armies. You had to, they would limit your social and physical mobility within the empire. Those rights would allow you to have legal and financial participation with the economy, with the social order. And you had to adopt their religion. When the Roman Empire fell, the structure of equality was reborn into the feudal medieval society of kingdoms. The rise of the European kingdom marks the time in which the word pagan used in the Roman Empire transitioned into the word peasant. And that's a really significant, because the pagans were probably the tribal people out of Britain and Spain and all these other regions. So they were then being called, well, because they didn't have Christianity, they were then being called pagans. And pagans becomes the word peasant. And peasant becomes this person who's landless but has to work all day for the guy setting up in the big house. And so you end up with this idea of this social order being based on inequality, and statuses again are being assigned to people to see how much they can participate, how much mobility, if they can marry. All these kinds of things are at the whim, not so much of the Roman citizen anymore, but of the king and the aristocracy and all his cousins and everybody else who are part of that family tree. Again, this is still a lot of information. Again, this is lots of editing going on. Yeah, this guy's helping me out here, the one head that's poking up there. I had to narrow out of all the possible subjects that could become part of this. I needed to come up with 3. You're only going, Eric, you're that's Leticia, you're only going to have time to address 3. People aren't going to sit there all day and listen to you go on and on. You got to pick 3. Anyway, centuries of revised versions of an economic order that imposes inequality and class discrimination to create rights and land inequality, enabling the model should be an S in there, models economic arrangements. And so that's Rome. Yeah, you're talking about slavery, you start to go into other regions. Centuries of natural environment exploitation to achieve economies. The third main view, or the third main theme, is centuries of military religious action towards animistic worldviews. The belief in plants and animals have souls and spirits. The best example that I came up, and I was really lucky, I really lucked out on this one. The whole idea about focusing in on the deforestation that happened in Europe. It was never just about the cutting downs of trees to build houses and build ships and when you start to look really closely, you see the agricultural on one side, and you start to see how long the natural growth is on that the guy's holding up. That is the thousands and thousands of years of environmental integrity, and how long it took for that particular type of plant to be able to survive what it did and give the overall system that it's in that much more integrity, so that when drought does come, when too much rain does come, it has the ability to survive those episodes. But if you're constantly just superimposing a certain one species plant into those systems and having it dominate those systems, that overall ecosystem begins to lose those abilities. And then you end up at flooding, you end up with a whole bunch of other types of situations. When that type of system fails, the first time it failed, maybe 100,000 people are going to be displaced, get bigger population. Next time it fails, the ante goes up, a couple million people are going to be displaced. The systems we're depending on right now, if those system fails, we're talking about hundreds of millions of people that are going to suffer the consequences of that kind of scheme. Again, this is where I'm saying I lucked out. This is where I lucked out. I came across this one study. This is talking about 1,000 years BC. Deforestation is starting to happen. By 300 BC, it's taken off quite a bit. You see improvements in agriculture. This grass all goes to the moldboard. More deforestation's happening. Again, it goes to more improvements in agriculture, bigger populations, get into shipbuilding, get into towns. By the time 1850 arrives and Christopher Columbus is across the ocean already, Europe is in such a place where they got so much people coming into the cities that the cities aren't prepared to be able to hold them. People don't even have wood to burn anymore to warm up their food. They're burning turf and these other types of things. There's hardly any fish in the water. All the big predators that would indicate a healthy forest and a healthy ecosystem, all of those have long disappeared. And so you end up with this collapsing of the economic model, and the people are being thrown to the wind out of that. And so it gives you're looking for a reason why European expansionism happened. That's why. Because they overworked the environments that they were in. They overmined everything, and the result was that the land lost its ability to look after everyone. Now, if Jeff Turner was here, he was going to bring some cedar over, and I was going to say, well, now, Jeff, there's a cedar tree. When you look at cedar trees, you would see something like maybe 10 inches across. When you look at those trees and realize that the entire East Coast was full of those, the entire ecosystems all the way across the land was full of this kind of strength. Yeah, yeah, poplars, you name it. They were absolutely huge. Some of them, they couldn't even carry them out of the bush once they got them down. They were so huge, like they just didn't have the technology to move them. Here we go. Again, I'm trying to get to how much time I got here. I guess I better tell myself that. Okay, doing good. Human belief systems and creation. Again, I've kind of went over parts of this, the animistic belief systems. And I wanted to emphasize that one of the turning points for Christianity was under Emperor Constantine. He started off as a pagan, but at the end of his life he became a Christian. And so there was a lot of social upheaval, because both groups, the people who weren't Christians were really at the same kind of political weight. They were both heavyweights in the same society. And so there's a lot of violence over who was going to be the ones to end up on the having this custodianship over human spirituality. I wanted to include those couple in the corner there that are disappearing because these are probably German, Irish. I mean, that picture is trying to capture that particular concept that all of these other races in Europe were again, tribal. They had a certain tribal outlook on things. And that most, the one point why I put it included the 2 Roman soldiers was Christianity picked up an institutional backing at that point, and that was military. That as it now went into other lands, it wasn't just the priest that was saying things anymore. He had his 2 friends standing behind him saying, well, you got to do what we're asking you to do. Can't really see that despite, this is Professor Lynn White. Again, it's kind of this worldview that we have. We think that the world revolves around our little globe, and really it doesn't. There's much, much, much more out there. Despite Darwin, we still do not see in our hearts or have it in our minds that we are actually part of a natural process. And so that's when I was creating that thing at the bottom there, I was trying to show that that's that word there, you would say akwenzi. That word means that this person that springs out of the land, and he starts to walk across the land, and as he gets older, he starts getting humped over more and more, and he walks back into the land again. And so that's kind of this whole, the language is able to catch that kind of concept. I had a great clip on papal bulls, but what is terra nullis? The land belonging to no person. Wanted to inject a little bit of humor in there, although it's probably not all that funny. But yeah, it kind of gives you this idea of that the papal bulls would deny human qualities to the people's lands that the empire had an interest in. And they did that by saying their belief systems were backwards or superstitious, or that they just did not have they were wandering around all over the place and just did not have the ingredients to become a people, or have the integrities of a people who had the legitimacy to own land, to have land. The Indigenous Worldview. So the approach that I used with this particular part of this talk was to first examine the European worldview. I could have started by talking about the Indigenous worldview and the ceremonies and the songs and everything, but a lot of that would still be evaluated from a European standpoint. The worldview that we've all kind of inherited, or some of us have partially inherited, and I really didn't, I wanted to sidestep that somehow and start off with an examination of the European worldview. The drawings that you see, and I gave a bit of a talk on this last week, was to Indigenous people believe that the animal world has a spiritual community out there. And our coexistence over thousands and thousands and thousands of years have somehow allowed us to enter into that world. When we dream, when we fast, when we sleep, these entities come and visit us, and they tell us stories, and they sing us songs. One of the songs was the ones we started off with. And so what that does is it shows that nature is an interactive, conscious existence. It's able to talk, it's able to interact. It has ability, it has agency, it has consciousness, it has the ability to connect to individuals and to people. And I would say that this is probably the tribal German, the tribal Spaniard, the tribal they also had these same things. They had these same views. This was all before the Romans had shown up. And so when indigenous people talk about their sacred relationship, these are some of the characteristics of what it is that they're talking about. And much more than that is that the indigenous people believe this is where mom and dad go to when they die. This is where grandpa and grandma are when they die. They go into that spirit world where these other beings, they go back into that community again. And so you don't have to look all that far to wonder why indigenous people were so resistant to give up their ways, their relationships to the land. And despite all the misunderstanding and all the prejudices, we continue to advocate that this is how things are. This is the arrangement that we are part. Well, not just us. We would say that this is the arrangement that humans had. that it's still there. I would. I'm not sure what's on the next one. That's kind of what I was going to go on about anyway. Pierre Trudeau and the Ministers' Conference in '83, as they were meeting with all the indigenous leaders, he kept going back and he says, we got to end this talk about the metaphysics. He says, we can't continue down this way and think we're going to get anywhere. And the indigenous leaders were saying, oh yes, we can. We're not gonna move until you start to accept that this view that we have is legitimate, because you'll never be able to see us without it. And so that's kind of where we're. This is going to be something that we're going to repeat. That is the end of the first part, the first installment. The idea is now to pass the mic around and see if there's anybody who wants to comment or volunteer a view. I will try to support that view, the whole thing now is pushing the lens in closer so you can have a look and there's more detail that's in there, or you pull the lens back and you start to see there's more and more connected to it. Anybody want to throw me a bone? Or it's okay if you don't. I mean, this stuff is kind of like, it's not on the main trail.
All right, a microphone. I so appreciate this, and there's a lot of stuff here that is new, and there's some stuff here that I've also done some studying on. And I always love having things become richer and broader, and there's just so much history to go through. One of the things I was really thinking about and talking about with a couple of friends, because I do wake up and think about economics and about worldviews, is this idea of our GDP, our gross domestic product, being this thing that motivates our world to just keep extracting, and that it's really, I think, important to know where that came from, these extractive practices that we have where we're just consistently taking from this earth that we're meant to be a part of, that we're not meant to be exploiting, but that we're meant to be in relationship with. And really appreciate hearing more about the roots of these three different worldviews, and interested in seeing what we can do to have more respectful relations with each other and with this entire world and all of our relations.
Hi, everybody. I'm Tyler. I'm really grateful to be here sitting with you all And thank you, Eric, and everyone for hosting this today. Yeah, this slide is making me think a lot about, from like an ecological perspective, that we all exist within a series of systems, our own individual system, family system, and the system within greater society, and how those different systems interact with each other, and then from the deeper historical perspective that I'm not too aware of, how then affects now. So I think like we only know the system that we're a part of, and that like I'm starting to challenge myself to take off my rose-colored glasses of the systems that I'm in, outside of the systems, to understand how my system affects and the systems that we interact with intersect and are all interconnected. And then the second point with nature. So I like to meditate. And so one day I was in the car and there's like a house fly. And so once I got in the car, the fly starts moving around. Zzz. I didn't like touch it, and I started meditating. And there's this music in India, it's a sitar, and it's a different type of instrument, but it has a very calming effect to it. Anyways, so I was meditating for about an hour, and the fly kept, and then as time went on, the fly started to fly around less. And then it was an hour and 30 minutes, the fly was sitting on my leg. And I looked into it. Flies actually have emotions. They can sense fear. They can have anxiety. So I too share that belief that nature is more than something that we observe, but that is a part of who we are as much. And there's a lot that we can learn from nature on how to provide compassion and empathy from a human perspective. So yeah, thank you for listening.
Paskamagazi Dotem. Given name is Janice, and one of the things I've learned on my journey is we're all connected, and everything is connected, and the dominant system has taught us that it isn't, that everything is separate. And so for me, coming to understand when Indigenous people use the term all my relations, at first I used to think, oh, my sisters, my brothers, my aunts, my uncles. It didn't ever really, it took me a long time to start to understand that all my relations is everything, is every living thing. And the earth is a living entity that gives us everything that we need. And we don't always comprehend that or see that as real. And that's the unlearning that I'm learning to do. And when you started with the drum, The drum is that heartbeat. And it is the earth's that's breathing us. And I think it's just really important that we start to feel that. And it's not even so much about understanding it here. It's here. It really is feeling it. And learning to respect it for what it is and what it gives us. All my relations.
Thank you, Janice. My name is Catherine, and I'm a recently retired teacher. I used to teach grade 7, and when we taught physical geography, we would teach along the lines of living, non-living. And there was always a difference, like inert things like earth and soil and water were not considered to have a living presence. And over time then, as my vision changed and I became more aware of a different worldview, my teaching changed. And more recently, I would be challenging my students to ask the question, like, what if when colonizers came here, what if everything shifted and it went the opposite way that it did? Instead of the colonizers taking this, then they came and were absorbed into it and became it. And it shifts everything. It turns everything upside down. And my kids are like, and I am too, because every time we talk about it, it's fresh. Because every year when I talk about things, I've grown and I've experienced different things and I've observed different things, and it became richer and really powerful. But the piece of water and trees and soil having a spirit and a living presence more and more speaks to me. And I think even you would consider the science would bear that out as we become more capable of knowing what is there and what it does for us. My most powerfully healing times have been in the woods. I go there purposefully to heal, and I know it works. I tell my children the same thing. If they're upset, if their anxiety, if their depression breaks in, I say, go to the woods. And you will find medicine. And I say that when I'm cycling, I said, medicine is in the woods. And that piece of understanding our part of it is, and I'm mostly right now grateful to be living in a time where it feels like it's not too late to get it back if we want it. But it's going to be a lot of work. But it feels hopeful. That's all. Thank you.
Extraction. When you're talking about the extraction part, when Rome would go into another land and they would take over their territory, and they would discover, well, hey, there's copper here. The Roman Empire didn't stop and say, okay, I guess we're all going to be copper miners now. No, they would make a deal with one of the senators and hand that land and that territory off to that senator and say, okay, we'll give you the slaves, you mine that copper, and you give the empire a share out of that. Now those poor old people that ended up in those mines were, died by the thousands. But you start to get the idea of how, and that senator would enter into a private, personal contract with the government, with the empire, to do that. And so, and these contracts were binding. you know, that they had to be respected. So really, you start to understand how old corporations and this idea of being able to make a deal with an individual and have those private rights respected and upheld, because it was the way to create some cash. And so that history of all that law, all those binding arrangements is way back in Roman times as well. Does anybody need a biological break? Yeah, take a short time out. Recess. Smoke break. Mm-hmm. I try and sing again, but I don't think it's. We'll finish up with one then. Okay. Hello again. I'm still Eric Johnson, and we're going to go into the second theme that we're scheduled to be addressed as part of this talk. The first idea was to talk about worldview construction as a European and what powered the development of those particular worldviews. The second part is to start from 1492 and go up to the nation state, which began in 1867. So this is, again, what we're doing is we're not only pushing the lens forward, we're pushing it inward so we get more detail again. First contact, colonization of the America on the eve of nation statism. Again, the three ships, the turtle, the worldview. I was really happy when I found that eyeball with the planet on it. I was thinking, man, I can make that work. This was intended to challenge the idea of discovery. And again, it's the meeting of two worlds, two opposing concepts of nature's relationship to humanity. Both people were ancient. The longevity was there with the Europeans as much as it was with the populations that were in North and South America. And we were sophisticated, intellectual property, knowledge about natural systems, about math, about the stars, about all of that was part of the intellectual consciousness that Indigenous people were working with. Now, Western, I thought this would be a good time to start talking about Western power structures. Again, like, everybody's saying Western power, what's a Western power structure? Like, what is that? And this is kind of about Professor Bob Thomas. He's not with us anymore, but he talks about this particular idea of the introduction of Western power structures into the North American continent. And we're going to, again, start to go deeper into those types of power, the structure examination. And now, what's being said here is that the Indigenous people had a mental experience with each one of these power structures. And it's not, it's sort of like, they see Columbus, see him get out of the boat. He's got a military guy with him. He's got a religious guy with him. He's got a guy that knows the telescope and how to read the stars, and so he's got some technology with him. But each one of those are power structures. Each structure has its own particular kind of logic at this point. There's a military logic, there's a religious type of logic, there's a technical, mechanical type of logic. These were all tied to a central idea, though, and that central idea was to recreate the same social economic order that they had experienced within Europe. And that was kind of the whole a misconception, was that they could only build upon what they already knew, and what they already knew was how Europe was organized. And so when they got here, shouldn't surprise anybody. They're looking at all these giant trees and say, well, first thing we got to do is cut down all these trees so we can start to plant some wheat, or we can start to plant our barley. And we can start to recreate the same system, the failing systems that are in Europe, that we can start to recreate those here. Indigenous people would begin to, their first part, they would get exposed to it. They would try and have a dialogue with it. They would even mimic it, only to find out that over time they would be excluded out of each one of those structures. Now, to try and bring it to a finer point, I was riding down the road with this neighbor of ours, and he's like a really deep religious fella. And my mom would get me to drive him out to town, and we'd come back with all his groceries and stuff. But I knew that he was a real hardcore Christian in the community, and then he was talking about Pierre Trudeau. I think it was Pierre Trudeau at the time. And he says, like, he was talking about, well, I'm going to vote for that guy. And he says, what are you going to do? And so I'm driving the car down the road, and I said, do you really think that Trudeau and those fellas are a part of us, or that we're a part of them? And he goes, I don't really know what you mean. And I said, well, okay, let me ask you this way. Do you think at some point that there's going to be an Anishinaabe prime minister? And you can see him sitting there thinking, and I'm just driving, and I said, well, let me ask you another way. Do you think at some point there's ever going to be an Anishinaabe pope? And then he got really quiet. And I thought, geez, I'm going to make this guy mad. And here I am in the truck with him. But then he finally said, no. He says, they're too racist. They're too prejudiced. They won't ever accept us. And I said, that's my point, is that although we've been exposed and we participated, it was never where we were going to have a lot of authority in one of those structures. It was never intended to be that. We would be subject to it, but at the same time we would be excluded from it as well. And I said we would never have any authority, would never have any control or influence, all the other, and these are the structures that are making reality for everybody. And so that's kind of why I've included it today, was to try to create this other view on things, and the amount of tremendous power that these institutions are exerting or have exerted. I seem to do a lot of ums here today. So here's, we're concentrating on the selected environment materials. And these are the big five. You look in the history books, and these are the big fives that are out there. These are what the entire landscape of Europe has been to accommodate these selected genetic materials. That would be the horse, the sheep, the cow, the pig, the goat, barley, and wheat. All other growth, all other biodiversity would be sacrificed to accommodate these specific species. North America, on the other hand, would be much more different. Whatever the values that Indigenous people were working with at that time or over that time somehow allowed all of these species to flourish to a huge extent. The entire South Dakota be covered in buffaloes. The buffaloes were not even, they counted billions of buffaloes on the prairies, but what's less documented is the number of buffaloes that were inside the forest themselves. And you don't even hear about that. To say, no, there was millions, if not billions, of buffaloes roaming inside the woods as well, and they were giants. Oh, I can relate to that. My big Wonka Tonka. But I'm just trying to like give people again, like this is about pushing the lens in and out. Sometimes it'll show you some more specific, but other times you pull it back and it starts to show you a much bigger picture. Again, that's just kind of what we already said. It's an equality of sacred relationships. It's not a hierarchy of relationships. The natural biodiversity doesn't get sacrificed in order to create this hierarchy of what gets to grow and what doesn't. I thought I'd put this in. That particular mountain lion was eating cows. And the people in the community were saying that this thing is here, this thing is around, we're seeing it. And the game wards would say, no, you got it wrong, there's got to be something else. And say, no, we're seeing this thing. And it's, you can have a gun, he says, but it's hunting you. I said, it's not scared of your gun, it's after you. And he says, and they got it because they were on skidoos. And they had to chase it down. They shot it a couple of times, and then it took off, and then they got on the skidoos, and they chased after it, and they finally caught up to it, but finally found out it was killing their cows. This again, the picture of the tree, the giant beaver. Our people have stories about these beavers and meeting these beavers inside the forest. And they said they're as big as bears. Like you'd think you're coming into a bear. And they said, no, that's... So the natural biodiversity that was there was so powerful. And it was, I put the picture of the canoe in there, and only because that the birch bark trees that were, the canoes were being built with, you wouldn't need a whole bunch of patchwork done because the trees were so big that you'd only need a couple of pieces to put that boat together. So again, just to emphasize whatever values are at the bottom of this that would allow all this, allow the strength. And at the same time, I wanted to include it in there to say, well, if the animals and the trees and the other things are at that level of strength, that also means that the indigenous people living there were also in that level of abundance. There wasn't just a couple of millions of us walking around. There was millions and upon millions of us that were here. And that's an illusion that needs to be questioned, brought into question, because the Papa bulls were out there trying to saying, this land is empty. And if you're not a Christian person, well, it's even more empty then. And that's really what the whole narrative was. And the early historians was to say that these lands were empty. There was no one here. Oh yeah, there was millions of us here, millions of us. And it was the diseases and all these other types of things that started to, and not really being recorded. They don't even want to record the fact that the Black Plague actually crossed the ocean and came here to North America, and it did the same amount of damage as it did over in Europe. Like you don't get that the Black Plague wasn't just happening in 5 or 7 years. It came in waves after waves. It would come back every 5 or 10 years, and it would start to make all kinds of people start to disappear. I'm going to beat up on the Papa bulls a little bit more. I think there's another. There he is. I had a whole series of these are all economic models in each age, and I would put each one of these ages up to say this is what was making the economy at that time, but it also is that inequality that you're seeing there that makes that system work in the first place. And I wanted to include this again. And that's me connecting to the estimates of North American populations. And so you kind of get this perception building that's going on with the head count in terms of how many people are in North America. Large ancient populations are equal to a civilization. If you just got a bunch of brown-skinned people running around, not really having any paths, not any permanent villages, well, there's not a very big population, and so that's being associated with a lower class of person or a lower class of land rights. And that's the perception. And it's kind of like some of this exercise is to peel off these perceptions and start to cut through those perceptions, but at the same time start to repair some of the perceptions that should start to be brought into focus. Again, the whole goal was to somehow legitimize the possession so that an exploitation of North America material could begin. All it required was for Indigenous people to be denied human qualities in order to create an inequality regarding their humanity. The denial focused on their animistic beliefs. European colonizing kingdoms wishing to legitimize the North American occupation allied themselves with Christian empire's political documents known as the Papal Bulls. And this is with Queen Elizabeth, even not really being a Catholic, she was Protestant, but she still references the Papal Bulls as granting her the authority to be able to go to lands that and establish some kind of idea of ownership with those lands. This one didn't quite make well, it kind of falls back into the false authority of empty lands and the absence of Christianity in order that people would have, if they were Christians, they would have at least an authority to hold land. Again, I included these last two only because of the inequality, and to say that there's more than just what Eric's talking about. There's scads of books and other things that talk about the indentured servant experience and the whole economic ideology of slavery and how all that took place. The indentured servants, a lot of them were people who were in the cities, couldn't find a job, couldn't look after themselves, got thrown in jail, couldn't pay the fine, and they said, well, okay, here's your choice. You become an indentured servant, you get on one of these boats, and you try your luck over there. Orphans, out of all the wars that were being fought were wars that were fought in and around the forest, and trying to say who owns the forest. The forest at that particular time was the oil of Europe. And so all the economy, all that ability to create commerce, all focused on the forest, who owned them, who had control of them, and who was in a position to exploit them. So you end up with all these orphans that are results out of these campaigns that are going on in Europe, and all the skirmishing that's going on. And okay. Another illusion to tackle would be these were just not wilderness lands, that they actually had parks where deer would come. They would have cotton, they had tobacco, they had knowledge of all these different plants. There was corn, there was the one thing that you kind of don't hear is that there was a lot of old people walking around these communities. People that were 100 years old. And you don't get that kind of longevity unless you got a lot of food and you've got the conditions for people to live that long and be in good health. And so that when you start to end up with populations with people are that old, that means that the population is not only older this way, it's bigger this way as well. There's more people in order to get that apex of people being able to live to those ripe old ages and having the health to be able to live that long. So that's, what am I doing here? I think my pointer gave up. Oh, here we go. Again, the institutional Western power structure. This, again, is one of them, the language itself. Whose beliefs or facts get repeated? Whose knowledges are validated and remembered? Who's identified as having valued knowledge? Whose language is being spoken? Whose stories and history are to be retold? Whose memories are going to be continued? This is an arrangement with the truth. And that's kind of that was the game of Canada's early education system, was to eliminate that personality from getting talked about, from getting told about. The ceremonies, best practices, counseling techniques, smudging, all of those things that have to do with emotional wellness. People would go through ceremonies. People who lost somebody, there would be ceremonies that you would go through. If that was fasting, if that was other types of ceremony, there'd be a ceremony of someone really suffered a big loss, that they would go back in the bush and they would get him to retell his story and his feelings, and the community would be standing around him, put their hands on him, and get him to let him know that he's not by himself, that there's terrible things that happen, that there's people around you that will support and help you work through those things, and there's a way through, that there is something after. There's just not despair, and you begin to associate that sorrow with those kinds of expressions of support. So it also has a link that's not so obvious to some of the aspirations that would be with self-government. And it's not just self-government in terms of the government relationship is being limited to just a self-administrative types of relationship. And that would be in health and housing and education. It is just not those, that it's strictly an administrative relationship that Indigenous leaders are talking about when they talk about self-government. I mean, programs are fine as far as they work, but they'll never make you feel like a people. They will. You go for you go to mom and dad for that. You go to grandpa and grandma for that. You go to somewhere else for that. You don't go to a program and say, well, that's going to make me feel like a people. That's going to make me feel worthwhile. That's going to make me feel like I belong. All of those things come from somewhere else, and they're the responsibility of someone else too. And so that's why it's so important for programs like this to be given that role of to say we know how to talk to these kids because we walked the same life as they did. We know what that is. We know those feelings that they're struggling with, and they need, and it's important that they know that they're not alone. So we're going to walk with them wherever it is that they need to go. It's important for them to see an Indigenous person standing on the other side of that counter and say, well, there's an indication that we belong. This is something that only us can champion these types of new realities and foster these types of perspective, these expectations that we want the kids to come forward with. Like no more looking down at your feet when you're talking to somebody. You look them straight in the eye and you say with a loud, clear voice, I'm so-and-so. This is what I want. And I'm going to keep asking you until I get what I want. So it's kind of not that they're going to be, all ganglangish about it, but but to say they got that confidence, that they've got that confidence with them. I included. I'm going to back up because that Roman guy was supposed to say something. I guess not. This is one of the handicaps I had. Anyways. Oh, I've got to go back one more. If that Roman guy was talking, he would say, "You fight in our armies. You speak our language. You pray to our gods. You show loyalty to our community. And you might get some rights laid on you." And so that's kind of the process of assimilation just didn't happen within Canada. It's a process that has its origins way back in those ancient times as well. So I'm going to march forward here. This is another Western power structure. What these little frames are all saying is that in each age, the North American mental experience has encountered all of this in one form or another. In one form or another, that Indigenous people have met all of these and lived through those times. In World War II, Indigenous communities, not only in the 1812s, in the 1600s, Pontiac, Tecumseh, all of those people, if you read up on Tecumseh in the War of 1812, you're going to find that army that he led determined much of the outcome if there was going to be a Canada in the first place, because the United States wanted these lands as well. 1845, you can look at almost any Indigenous communities that you're going to find a really high sign-up rate in each one of these world conflicts. My community, about 110 sign-up. It went over 100% sign-up because there was women who were also enlisting. And that meant that there was only 3 disabled guys who were walking in our reserve for about the last 5 years during that war. And when these guys came back, they were hard. They were hard people. They couldn't sleep at night because they couldn't live with what they did. There wasn't any treatment centers around. There wasn't any deprogramming that they could go into. But the families and other people that were there had to try to put them back, put back those make that person whole again. So this is kind of that's one big phenomena that went through all the communities in terms of stepping up, putting themselves in harm's way in a big way. I want to keep mushing forward here. Again, another power structure. Each age of Indigenous people would encounter this institution. They would be exposed to this institution. They would try to participate with this institution. And in the end, they would be excluded from that institution, and that institution would take their children. And we're just now coming to a better understanding of what the end reality of that was, what were the larger purposes that were powering this policy, and what was the outcome that was being looked for. Again, politically, there's Queen Elizabeth. I'm not quite sure who that fella is, but that's 1812. again, Pontiac, Tecumseh. You notice these fellas are all in military dress. That's 1867. (1940). There's Pete. There's Brian Mulroney. Then Eric Nielsen Task Force Report. Harrison Ford. Mr. Harper. And we got Justin. I would go back to the Eric Nielsen. Go ahead.
I was just wondering, after the American Revolutionary War, when I think it was called the Niagara Conference was up, do you think if Washington hadn't do you think that if Washington hadn't have stood up and declared that the land was the Ohio Valley was worth too much to settle the problems, that things would be different for us today? Am I making sense?
I think the whole question about colonization was, it really doesn't get that attached to that. What was happening in the world was that it was a world war, and Spaniards and French and English and everybody else were trying to end up with the material prize that was inside North America.
Right. Okay.
And whatever it took, like the behind the scenes, is that it wouldn't have been just George Washington.
It would have been
the
somebody else.
Banks. It would have been the other people saying, "You gonna get that land,
Right. Yeah.
and we're gonna pour some money into your struggling
Yeah.
country."
Yeah.
And it's the kind of the same game that's there. One point that why I included the Eric Nielsen Task Force Report is it's a government initiative where the government started to shrink its responsibilities. As it was shrinking its responsibilities, it started to hand off responsibilities to private citizens, to private groups, private corporations. Now, Native people were being asked to say, well, if you want a shot at self-government, here's your chance. And by the way, here's the post-secondary fund. You're going to have this much dollars. You administer those dollars. You are the one that gets to decide who stays and who goes. You are the one who gets to decide who gets a house and who doesn't. You're the one that's going to decide who gets a health service or not. The thing was, they weren't told was that these budgets were already going to be capped as they were being sent down to the reservation level. And in the end, chiefs and councils would be administering their own poverty. And that was kind of like the big game. That was going to be like, let's get them into signing these agreements. We know that these fundings are inadequate. We know that there's never going to be enough money to get all those kids a post-secondary education, but we'll give them this responsibility. It'll create a few on-reserve jobs, but for the most part, we kind of know that it's all going to bottleneck, and it's going to be the chief and councils that are going to be left making the hard calls with that. Now that was kind of like we were never intended to find out about that report. It's just that they had an Indigenous person working in the government at that time, and he smuggled out one of this report. And it must have took him a couple of tries too, because when you see the report in its physical shape, you're talking about volumes of that report. And people like Russell Dibo and other people would look through that report with great detail about how the government was going to orchestrate this transfer of programs and dollars and money, with the idea that Indigenous communities would get a certain shot at certain programming, but the lion's share of those more sophisticated programs would be given to the town next to them or the other town next to them, so that Indigenous people would be slowly squeezed out of the poor reserve type of administration and forced into the mainstream administration, where they were not even the owners of their own problems. There, they would continue to be clients, and that's just a step away from being a ward to the government. So they're going to say, well, you're not going to be a ward of the government. You're just going to be this troubled, poor person that has to go to the town next to you so that you can get something. So you still end up being the ward. You still carry this ward type, and it's very subtle. It's very not all of it. You don't get to see it. It's not till people get to stand back and look at all of that and say, wow, this is really like a sophisticated cloak and dagger type of relationship. Anyway, I thought that was worth, again, technology. How many people heard of the whites of, how many people heard the don't shoot until you see the whites of their eyes? That comes from, you all seen that gun with the big horn, the blunderbuss or whatever they called it? And the idea was that the instructions that were to people on the line would be, we got to make these Indians believe that when this thing blows up, like somebody's going to die. And he says, so don't shoot until you see the whites of your eyes, because then they're going to link this big explosion, that ball hitting somebody dying, and that's what we want them to think. And so that whole cause and effect and that optics is all in there. That's why those instructions were as they were. But there was other instructions, was that they were to allow Indigenous people to carry those weapons, but it was absolutely, absolutely forbidden for one of them to be shown how to make one of these things. That part of that technology is never going to be shown to these people. And there are written structures, there are written orders saying exactly that to the frontline officers when they're encountering, trying to enlist Indigenous people to help in the Beaver War or whatever war is happening at that time. So that's a point to, again, we are at a stop point. And this is where we start to pass around the mic. And again, the goal is to try and push us forward, but at the same time try to get some. And believe me, this stuff is off the trail kind of stuff. These analyses are very, very rarely brought to the floor. Really, like, not shared nearly enough for people to start to think about them. And then even after you hear the information, I could be standing here for the next hour and a half, and I could be telling you the absolute truth. It's still going to take you an hour and a half to start to compare it to other things that you know, other pieces of information that you might have heard somewhere else, and then you start to sensitize it. You start to attach it to have a little more meaning with you. And that's really how education, experience, and all that works, is that you'll get all kinds of information, but you still need that hour and a half to kind of process and make connections with what you're being told with. So anyways, does anybody have any questions? And if I can't answer it, I'll find, I can give you some references to people that would probably be able to put you on the path.
I'm probably gonna need like a bunch of time to digest everything that you just mentioned. But yeah, like with evil, like at that time, like was morality even understood as a concept, that like morality came later, or through or morality came through indigenous culture, but they didn't take the time to understand indigenous culture, therefore they didn't have the ability to be aware of morality or the concept of their immorality. That's kind of a loaded question. I don't know if
No.
essentially, like, do you think as early in that time, if with morality or psychology, were they just not even known?
Not really.
Yeah.
It's surprising how quickly morality shows up. It's almost there was a period at the time when indentured servitude was starting to happen, and people were being shipped into overseas and coming to North America, half of them dying. Just kind of. But the thing that starts to reveal itself was there was a window of relationship building that occurred. And what occurred was when you had Indians and blacks and indentured servants all living in the same society, all faced with the same labor, and they started having families.
Yeah.
And there was a solidarity that started to form with these people.
Yeah.
And that's what the plantation owners all start getting worried about this, to say, these people are getting along. And there's some correspondence that you would read to say, it's getting hard to tell an Englishman from a black person, because the black person was getting lighter and the English person was getting darker. And he says, so there's a solidarity that probably didn't even really exist in Europe yet, but given just even a couple of 20, 30, 40 years, all of these other kinds of relationships and forms of solidarity started to manifest themselves.
It's it just makes me think because it seems like, well, before that's those are conservative values, individual, deserving, undeserving, that seems to have, values that are in Canadian society today in some ways. And yeah, it just makes me think that that the love early, like you'd mentioned, between different people in the communities had feared those of the individualistic view, and that it was power that overrided love, and that and I'm kind of going off track, but in the United States there are polygamous groups, and what's interesting when looking at it is regardless of what everyone's beliefs are of it, they all loved each other, and they were able to create the community, but a growing community within what they have. And that I wonder if that was something that they were able to conceive of the future, and seeing that, well, they're getting along, they're starting to develop, and it's almost as though you were a competitor, there's McDonald's, Tim Hortons. It's they saw that there was more potential, so they wanted to shut that down as early as possible. And that why it's not in, I went to Catholic school, there was no mention of any of this, but that, yeah, that was one other thought that I had, but I'll let somebody else.
Something you said that stuck out to me was the conversation you had with someone talking about Pierre Trudeau and voting for him in whenever that was. To what extent do you think is good to vote and participate in the the colonizer state versus investing your energy more in other things? I wasn't really sure exactly your angle on that when you were talking and questioning whether that person was going to vote. Was it more specifically about Trudeau himself, or more specifically about voting in the colonizer state system itself?
When Trudeau's comment about the metaphysics, we got to get out of this metaphysic type of mode of talk that we're in right now. We got to talk about legalities and so if there's a bed of sweetgrass somewhere, Indigenous people with their management plan would say, well, okay, we're going to assign a certain value to that. We're going to protect that. If there's a sage bush somewhere, and they're going to say, well, we're going to have a certain amount of value to that. We're going to protect that. There's water sources. Well, we're going to assign value to that, and we're going to protect that. There's a burial ground over there. We're going to assign a value to that, and we're going to protect that. There's certain healing plants that only grow in certain situations, and we're going to assign a value to that, and we're going to protect that. You would find that, and why would you protect those things? Well, you would protect those things because they are part of your spiritual community. They've got nothing to do with making money. They got everything to do with protecting the natural environments that are there. And that sentiment, that commitment is your spiritual commitment, your metaphysical commitment to those types of entities. So when Trudeau off the cup kind of says that and say, well, we're not going to talk about that. I'll say, well, yeah, you got to talk about that because that's what treaty rights are. That's what wampum belt rights are. These are the identity. We're willing to participate within Canadian society, but we're bringing our cultural personality with us. We're not leaving it outside the door. We're not leaving it outside the courtroom. We're bringing this personality and all the commitments and all the other things that means with us. And we're bringing our language with us too, because this language is what describes all this and how this all fits together in the first place. So at the end of the conversation is to say, okay, now we're starting to talk about reconciliation then. Restoration of language. Keeping the knowledges intact of that we know about all these different plants and about all the other healing properties, which Indigenous people already have been a major contributing presence to. In addition to military, in addition to land, in addition to, other types of philosophies, in addition to other things, is that we've always had this contributing presence to the domestic society that people today find themselves in. And whether that's fruit and vegetables and all of that is there. And we're saying we're stepping into history, and as we enter this stage, we're bringing all of these things along with us. And we're not going to be denied that anymore, that we are actually always had this contributing presence to what was ever going on in this continent from 1492 till now. So, and it's not going to be because that we're on welfare, and it's not going to be because you're feeling sorry for us. It's not going to. No, what we're talking about is real hardcore components to a perspective of us that has justice in it. And as a matter of fact, that the children, black, yellow, red, they will all benefit from that. They will all benefit from it. It's not going to be told in a story in such a way where somebody else gets excluded. The story that needs to get told is such a one that where everybody is included in it. So I kind of get on my own soapbox. You got me carried away. Thanks, Vince.
Yeah.
All right, keep pushing on. All right, got just enough steam to finish this up. Anybody need a bio break? No? Yes? 5 minutes? Sure. Okay, let's do a 5-minute break then.
Really good at explaining and going to the historical perspective.
totally understandable. I'm just trying to keep this talk within a certain beginning point and a certain end point. So we're going to keep going, kind of knowing that people will be still kind of trickling in. This next part is from 1867 to the present, and it's going to get a little more political as we start going forward with this. I found this particular drawing, I think it kind of shows the different stages that Canada as a nation state went through. I really wish some of my power clips were included in this. But it kind of gets into this Canada's creation story is of an extension of a European Canadian worldview. For the most part, Indigenous people are rejecting how they've been portrayed within that story as it currently is. It's probably what may not be so obvious is that what I've been talking about is really not about Indigenous history. What I've been talking about, in fact, is Canada's origin story. This is their story. The fact that they took Indigenous land tells absolutely nothing about who the Indigenous people are. The fact that they enslaved another people tells them absolutely nothing about the people that they enslaved. This is Canada's origin story. So when we talk about these kinds of histories, what we're talking about is their origin, what their governments and policies are responsible for, and how they got their beginnings. And part of that was to tell the story in such a way that they were seen as the good guys, the charity type of people, and to say, you know, there's that's quite not how it actually played out in reality. Although there was good people on both sides of the aisle. The fact that British people and Indigenous people both died in the same conflicts. Some of the story that doesn't get told, though, is that in Owen Sound, there's a graveyard that's in the center of town there. And it was my cousin Darlene that who put us on to that 1 acre that was inside one of the treaties. And they said, well, the Indigenous people wanted to make sure that their grave sites were being looked after. And so that was a really important thing. And she brought it to us. I was on chief and council at that point, and she says, you know, this is something that's we got to look into. And so we said, all right, go and do the title searches, go and do these other things, and let's see what's what over there. Anyways, when she started to look at what was actually there, she says, yeah, this land has houses on top of it, and it's an Indigenous burial site, and it's right in the middle of town. And so we just said, well, okay, let's, so we went to the next step. We hired a professional researcher that both sides would agree on to do the research. What that lady came back with was all the transactions, all the other things that had happened to each one of those parcels of land as time went by. And what it started to reveal was that the lands were sold, one was sold to a brick making company, so the soil was all dug up, and basically they started to make bricks out of the soil that was there. The graves that were inside that particular burial ground were the warriors that had participated in the War of 1812. So our warriors and people who contributed to Canada got made into bricks. And then that whole Chamazel got paved over, and the records lost, and all the other stuff somehow, don't know what happened to it. And so we, and the graves were being looted. The warriors would have their muskets and their bows and arrows, and all of them would be wrapped in British flags. And these were all people that came out of the Battle of Detroit, and they got shipped up to the Owen Sound area, and they got laid to rest there. But all of that history got put off to the side. So, and people were stealing all this stuff. So anyways, we were constantly pushing the government to say, give us that research. We coughed up the $60,000 to do it. Give us that research. And then our chief, he was kind of like trying to be the nice guy, and while we weren't in a very, so we were constantly putting the spurs to him to say, get that research over here. Just don't be talking to him on a phone. Like, if we have to go over there and do that, that's what we're going to go and do. And so he phoned every second day. He was phoning, and then finally, I guess the person that the report was given to, they went on vacation, and the report was the research was like this, and it was sitting on top of his desk, and we kept phoning the next person under him, and then finally, they said, her boss said, go get that research, photocopy it all, send one up to Nawash and Saugeen, and like let's be done with it. I'm tired of these people calling us. So the research that got sent up to us was the unedited version of what happened to the land. And so we read through it, and you could just see the guys and the ladies' faces, like they started to get like angry about what happened to these parcels of land. We met with Indian Affairs, and we asked them, oh, what about the research and that? And we let them talk for about an hour, and there was not one mention about the brick making mill, about the graves being looted, about all this other stuff that had happened to that land. And finally, we just kind of said, that's enough. You guys are lying to us. We know you're lying to us. We read the report. You guys are talking about this as if nothing happened. And we know something happened. And you've been sitting here for over an hour lying to our faces over it. And I said, we're done. We're done talking to you guys. You had your chance to come clean, but you didn't. And so we went and occupied those graveyards. But it was kind of like a flashpoint where what the government was going to do was going to buy those lands without raising all these other issues. And we said, well, that's not good enough. This is going to be public. And so that's what we did, was we went and occupied those lands. But it's that kind of perception that needs to be addressed in some way, to say that we need to be put in that history, that record of who we were and how we behaved and what we contributed. It has to be made public. So this is kind of like this story that they say, well, no, there were no graveyards. And they're saying, yes, there were graveyards there. And not only that, they had veterans from the War of 1812 in them. So we're back at the First Minister Conference. Pierre gave his, actually, I think Pierre is supposed to be in on this one. There he is. His famous remarks, you no longer speak your language or practice your ceremonies, or you have your own institutions, then You are here today in the 1983 First Ministers' Conference as Canadian subjects because you have accepted our social order and have been assimilated. It's lucky we had our politicians on the ball at the time said, no, we are here today because you have occupied our lands and communities and imposed your institutions on us. Your government has abducted generations of our children despite the fact that we were your military allies in the War of 1812. Assimilation is your attempt to erase our culture and language from human memory in order to prevent our ability to question your origins and to see ourselves as legitimate people. And so you end up in this dialogue where there's a certain narrative that's starting to try to happen, but you have Indigenous people pushing back on it. And they're saying, no, there's another explanation there's another, there's more to this story than what that's wanting to be admitted to at this point. Let me see. I included this one, well, because this is the Educational Institute and our missions are to support the students in a whole variety of ways. But behind all that is this other intergenerational theory that's at work here. And education functions as an instrument in which is used to facilitate the integration of younger generation into the logic of the present system. It brings about conformity. It brings about the practice of freedom. It's the means by which men and women deal critically and creatively with reality. It is discovery of how to participate in the transformation of the world as it's happening around us. And how do we, and so this whole, the idea of what are the goals of education. And that's kind of what more and more people are saying, that our education institutions are under pressure to catch up to the huge amount of information that's now becoming available to folks. And there's a way that to start to ask old questions, knowing that there's the possibility of better answers, a better a direction that can be set. So anyways, this is Paulo Freire's book, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed. It's a difficult read, but it's a good read. Oh, there's that Roman guy. I knew I included him with saying something. You pray to our God. So this is the arrangement. Another good book I wanted to include at this point was Inflamed by these two authors. These guys got a tremendously powerful perception of things. They talk about the biodiversity that needs to be maintained because inside people they have all these microorganisms that actually build up better immunities to diseases, and that we need that mixture of biodiversity if we want to continue to have not end up with just one more overworked strain of creation, like the one particular type of rice or one particular kind of grain that eventually peters out because it doesn't have any of the biodiversity supporting it. And there's Gene, I'm not Gene, this is John A. McDonald. I wanted to put this, I've talked like a good part of these particular, the 18th the Constitution. I never thought this Professor Robert Pawlowski would say what he said, but he did. He said, and he put it in such a nutshell. And I like things in a nutshell. To say, man, one sentence, I can understand that. I can wrap my head around that. And for him to say, like, without the political recognition of Indigenous status, the cultural rights, the language rights, the spiritual rights, didn't stand a chance. Didn't stand a chance. because it would have been that recognition that would have protected those things. Just like for other countries, it's just that there's certain things that get protected, and they're protected to ensure the longevity of the core pieces that make an identifiable people. It gives commitment to that. And I think a lot of us are probably somewhat familiar with this. This is pretty widely circulated. No, the one thing that I wanted to kind of add to this is that even by 1868, 69, I was reading through the House of Commons publications, and on one hand you have the government talking about Indians starving out in Manitoba and Saskatchewan, and then in the same discussion you have the House of Commons talking about this woman in downtown Montreal who had to cook her cat in order to survive. And I said, like, how do you end up with both starvation scenarios playing themselves out in a country that is so bountiful, that is like incredibly rich, and here you have people getting caught in these terrible kinds of conditions. Person had to eat their cat. I was thinking, but what it does tell you is that even at that stage, that the land had been so pressed and so denuded of its abilities that it was losing its ability to produce. A lot of that ability to participate with that production was already disappearing. People did not have in the same publication, you end up with people getting up and they're talking about, we do not want a repeat of the same systems that are in London, England. We do not want that to happen here in Canada. We really resent that this is the way that things are going. All these groups that have tremendous land holdings, but really no obligation to the greater good. She said like that. We don't. So people are viewing this even as the country is forming, that they're saying, we're really against a repeating of the same scenario that happened in England and other places. We don't want that. We don't want that. We're only a small percentage owns everything, and everybody else has to somehow tough it out and start eating their cats, kind of thing. So, anyways, that's all worth. I thought that was worth echoing. Okay. Oh yeah, here we go. I did a small breakdown of who was actually elected in 1867, and this is kind of how the numbers shake out. A lot of them are lawyers, a lot of them were judges, a lot of them were surveyors, a lot of them were town reeves, a lot of them had holdings and interests within timber companies, within construction companies. Some of them are just farmers. Some of them are real estate. These are all the first leaders of the first election in 1867. The remaining were kind of like subsidiary types of business interests. So really, what you're seeing is the lion's share of the leadership are private corporations that are running the country and setting policy and setting up relationships with Indigenous people, which was not all that great to begin with, but even more adversarial if Indigenous people are seen as getting in the way of certain economic ideas or schemes that are wanting to be put into action. I thought I'd throw this in something interesting. How many people can tell me what that stone thing is there? And it's really hard to see. Go ahead.
I think it's a memorial of some sort, but it's
It's Roman. Well, what that it does have all the features of being that memorial. Yeah,
Sorry?
go ahead.
So I was saying that it's Roman, and it's a memorial, possibly to a battle, or something significant happened. So it's a memorial to, probably a man or a figurehead of some sort.
Okay. What that is, in fact, is the first GPS system. And
Oh.
what that is something that's been put on the road every mile, so that anybody who's on that road who's not Roman, does not have the papers of saying where they were going, did not have the right credentials on them, they were not supposed to be on that road. It could tell you exactly how far you of the next town that was behind you, and it could tell you where the next town was, and where you were being allowed to traverse along. What that is a physical monitoring restraint on how you participate with the empire. And if you don't have the right credentials on you, they're going to give you a hard time if they run into you. And to say that, and so this is how, why I put that beside that piece of paper that is that what Indigenous people had to leave the reserve with. They had to get the authorization to be able to leave the reserve in the first place. Which means that what we're looking at is you're not able to participate legally, you're not able to participate in the finances, you're not able to travel physically, you can't participate politically. All of those things are being brought to bear under the Indian Act. And so that it's restricting you to be able to participate in whatever shape, form, even physical movement, that you cannot do that unless you got certain documentation on your person. And so and then it's one of those aha things when you start to say, wow, and these are how the Romans thought. I guess this thinking that I'm talking about is like a couple of thousand years old, but they're just kind of like, yeah, like we got to make sure that we know who's out there and where they are and what they're doing, and that we're in that much control of the situation. Yeah. So, anyways, I thought it was worth putting up there for. We're probably all familiar again with this. The physical coercion with Indigenous students or Indigenous people as the Indian Act was being imposed was not as severe or open with the adults, because the adults could fight back. A lot of that was centered on the kids. And so they were seen as the weakest link to maintaining the cultural integrity, to maintaining the language, to maintaining all the other things that would give a rallying point to the next generation of children that were coming in, that were going to be born in the future. And so, and I think that they were able to have the government and the policy creators had a pretty good beat on that. I was riding home one night and I was listening to this discussion about Jesus in the temple, and when he chased out everybody that was gambling and doing all this other stuff inside the church. And I guess he got pretty wild, and he tipped over a bunch of tables, and you guys gotta go. can't be doing that stuff in here. And it's funny, they kind of like, but some of the questions they were saying was like, are you related to the emperor? He goes, no. Well, are you in the army somewhere? Are you? No, I'm not a general or anything. Well, are you rich? Are you like a rich person? No. Well, by what authority do you come here and try to tell us we can't do that? And his answer was, Creator. Creator told me it's not right. And that's the first time that they really realized that here's another power structure. And it's got nothing to do with society. It's got nothing to do with it. He's getting his direction from the Creator himself. And it's able to sustain him and face incredible obstacles, incredible prejudice, and have the courage to be able to stand there and look all these people in the eyes like, we got to do something about this. This is really something, that this person is able to summon all that courage. The one thing about it, though, is that that's kind of what was being under attack when they started to take Indigenous people's ideas of cultural sacredness to the land. What it started to push us out of the light of being a decent people anymore. And to say that we got shoved out of that light. We weren't moral enough. We weren't good looking enough. We weren't smart enough. We were backwards. We were superstitious. And what all that was degrading and cheapening our personality, and trying to reframe it in that we did not have the ingredients to be a decent moral people anymore. And so that's kind of another point of reconciliation that also needs to get around to be addressed. These are the kind of a time frame in terms of how the big events. I want to put the spurs to this session a little bit. Only existing Aboriginal treaty rights of people of Canada are hereby recognized and affirmed. That's the one clause that is inside the Constitution. Now, when I was in the room at the time when the chiefs were first hearing that this existing is a phrase that's in there. And what the government was saying to Indigenous people at that point was they were saying anything that the province has not legislated over already, anything that the federal government has not legislated over already, anything that is not inside of an agreement already, all of those rights do no longer exist, because those authorities now belong to these different entities. But there was still a group in that room that was saying, no, wait a minute. Our rights existed in the past, our rights exist now, our rights are going to exist in the future, because we're still here. We're still here. And we still have all the same integrities that we did of way back when to now to then. But there was someone that was able to stand up and say that. So that's Wampanoag treaties and the Confederation. We kind of went through the Royal Proclamation. That's the Pontiac. I wanted to spend, like, is there any Haudenosaunee people in the room right now? If there were, I'd be, guys had it going on. Like, it was the first forum that British people, Spanish people, French people pursued and participated in. They behaved in such a way that they recognized the authority that was inside these things that are up on the screen right now. And some people would say, well, what is a Wampanoag? What is that? What does that really have to do with anything? It's made out of shells and such. When I used to give this talk down in California, I'd say, well, we all kind of heard it. Well, since we're talking about Romans anyway, I'd say, well, when Caesar would pull out that he'd have this scepter, this long scepter of some sort. And then if he sent an ambassador, say, down to Egypt, he would say, hey, you're going down there to talk to that group, take this with you. If they do not do the bidding, you pull that out and you tell them, this is what I said. And so they'd be down there in some kind of negotiations with the Egyptians or whoever. And if there was a lot of resistance, that they were saying, we're not going along with these ideas, man. These ideas are really terrible. We're giving you a flat out no. That ambassador would pull that scepter out, and by the power of Caesar, or the emperor, he sent me here and he told me to pull this out. And when I pull this out, you will do my bidding. Because if you don't, next year there's going to be legions marching out of Rome to here, and they will put you in a frame of mind where you are going to do our bidding. So here you have this authority. It's the same thing with this, as that person when they pull that wampum belt out. Because all those little individual beads represent all the other communities that went into creating that belt in the first place. All of that has been discussed. Each one of those beads represents the warriors of those communities that were in conversation, consulted with, committed to, because they brought those beads to that meeting and said, here is our support to this idea. And so what they're in fact doing is they're holding up all these warriors and all these communities that are committed to this instrument. It is a system that has the ability to summon power. It is a system that can invest that power. It is a system that can distribute that power to make it do what it wants to do, have people cooperate in such a way with all the right expectations to that go along with, and you would invoke it with that wampum belt. This system, when in the earliest of colonization, as you have British and other people participating with this forum. Once they found out that there was beads that were in travel, that there was beads that were in motion, or these shells, the governments would be saying, we got to participate in that. Go and find out what it is those people are going to be talking about, because we want to be part of that. If an indigenous person was going through the forest at any particular point, all he would have to do is hold up these beads, and everybody would just back off, give them clear passage. There was diplomatic immunity because they knew that those beads were of such high importance that there was a lot of politics, and whatever was coming out then also had the ability to create war or bad relationships. So it was there. It's not obvious to see. Even after they went to the meeting, the British people had traveled hundreds of miles to go and participate in these meetings. As soon as those persons came back to the city that they had come from, the governor of that town would say, okay, I want you to show me what was said. Tell me word for word what was said. Tell me the ceremonies that they went through. Show me the dances. Show me the different ceremonies that you went through while you were participating in this. And even though there was just 2 or 3, 4 non-native people sitting in that room, there wouldn't, even if there was an Indian in town, they would sit in that room and they would go through these dances and they would go through these ceremonies. They would go, because what they were in fact doing was they were saying, we have to get this right. We can't be sitting in these meetings rolling our eyes thinking, well, geez, I wish this guy would quit, like right now, I wish this Eric would quit talking. but the kind of, like to say, we got to get this right. We want them to know we're taking them seriously. And so what are the kinds of things that are being said? Well, the things that are being said is, because they're dealing with rape, they're dealing with murder, they're dealing with violence, they're dealing with all kinds of stuff. They're saying, let me wipe away your eyes so that you can see me clearly. I will wipe the tears from my eyes so that I can see you clearly. Let me clean out my ears so that you know that I'm really trying to listen to you. Let me clear out my throat so that you know that I want to be clear with what it is that I'm saying to you. All of those, when you start to step back and look at them, are all fundamental relationship builders. That what you're doing, in fact, is taking the other person seriously. You're saying these things so that they know that you're trying to be sincere and that you really are trying to let them know that you're with them, that you're really taking them serious, that you see them, that you hear them, and that they will speak clearly and plainly with you. All of those are really human relationship builders. You almost can't have a relationship without that. Who wants to be sitting beside someone who lies all the time? Who wants to be sitting with someone, you know, that just kind of not even looking at you when they're talking to you? They're off somewhere else. I mean, those are all. So when you start to look at the fundamental natures of these kinds of gestures, there's a lot more to this system than was previously awarded. That these have much more significance. And that's the end. We're now into the session of truth and reconciliation. And we still have 15 minutes, but again, the idea was to unpack some kind of talk like this and to say it may not necessarily be a situation where let's meet the Indians halfway. Part of what is here is what is the common ground that we all stand on. Part of the truth is the one that's being asked to remember the truth, or to say what is the truth. They are the ones who get to decide when enough truth has been uncovered. They are the ones who get to decide that when enough has been remembered that represents the truth. And so just like those graveyards, just like those graveyards of those little ones, it's the Indigenous people that get to say when enough has been investigated, when enough truth has been uncovered, and then we can start to talk about what has to be done. But until in my mind, and this is just me, in my mind, until the Papa Bowls and other things get brought up on the table, and those start to get rescinded, and they start to cough up the records to who those children were inside those graves, then we're probably nearing the point of being able to talk about reconciliation on that particular issue. And that's a tough road. I mean, it takes really sincere, again, let me wipe away the tears. Let me show you that I know that I'm really listening to you. Let me know that I'm speaking the truth. I'm going to behave in such a way that you're going to know I'm speaking the truth to you. So that is all part of what's there. And that's just on that one particular incident. The testimonies to what happened are still coming in. A lot of these people took these stories to their graves with them, except that their nephews were sitting around listening to them. And that so all of these stories are starting to surface again, to say, yeah, I remember this. I remember my uncle talking about this. I remember this old man that I used to go and interview was talking about this stuff. That was like 40, 50 years ago. Anyways, any floor is open again if people want to wade in.
First of all, thank you very much, Eric. This has been really enlightening, and I know you've put a lot of time and effort into compiling your thoughts. I've seen you at work, and I've seen you sweating over this, and I told you yesterday I knew that you could get up for 3 hours and provide a lot of valuable information, and you've done it. The thing I think I've come to recognize the most is how old these structures and forces that drive colonization are. Like when you portray the Roman Empire the way you did, it's clear that things were put in place back then, maybe even before then. The Romans must have learned it from somebody, and it's a playbook of power and greed that benefits the few at the top, that is just been replayed over and over and over again. And the, with the final slide, truth and reconciliation, it makes me wonder. Well, first of all, it also makes me realize that we've almost all been played. There's only a few at the top, and many of us have been, victimized by this. Some much more than others, but we're all being played. And what can we do to stop it? What can we do to reconcile, to repair, and to move forward? That's, our eyes are opened, and now where do we go from here is the question that I'm left with. But thank you. I really feel like you've opened my eyes to some things I hadn't considered in the past. So thank you very much.
Yeah, it's pieces that are just. Sometimes you have to wait 10 years for that piece to come, and then you start to measure it and say, that fits to this part of that story. Maybe with another 5 years, or you walk into another conversation and say, that part fits.
I guess I just had a thought, and I'm wondering, with this birth of truth and reconciliation over the past 2-3 years, and with this being the second National Day of Truth and Reconciliation, do you see this as a seedling of hope for a proper balance between the cultures on Turtle Island, or at least in the northern half of Turtle Island, or is it just another play from an ancient playbook?
I guess the one concern would be does the recognition of Indigenous rights mean access to resources or other types of things just so that they can adapt their rights to the bigger systems that are already in play? And people would be right to question if is that really where we want to head to, is just have one more person dragging all these resources out of the ground, enabling all these other things that are basically taking civilization into the ditch. Is that the logic and the reasoning we want to follow? So that's part of, on the other side, when Indigenous people say, yes, we have sovereignty, but our sovereignty is through ceremony with the natural world. So that when we have sage bushes, and when we have medicinal plants, and when we have water sources, and when we have burial grounds, and when we have clan relationships with whitefish and moose and all those other types of our sovereignty is expressed with these relationships. It's not a hierarchy of relationships. It's a relationships that is connecting us to the natural world that's out there, and that's our sovereignty. I guess some of the common ground then would be does the Canadian nation state have the same moral fiber to say, yes, we can see where our kids would benefit from that type of approach to managing natural resources, natural water, natural biodiversity, that there's some real benefits. And I guess what it kind of does is all of our kids are on the land, so they're all at risk. Everybody's kids are at risk at this point. And the vision that's being asked for has to be a big enough dream so that everybody can fit into it. And that's the real challenge. That's the bigger challenge that's there. Anyways, I kind of hope that makes sense.
Miigwech. Thank you, Eric, for that very important and enlightening presentation. Truth and reconciliation, there is a lot of truth that has to be uncovered. And this is a start, and certainly these days are a start of that path of understanding truth. I think part of the reconciliation comes with accepting and acknowledging and inviting the understanding of the wealth of knowledge and culture that the Indigenous people in Canada have to offer, and the wisdom practices that we had practiced for millennium until the settlers arrived, that actually cared for this territory in a very important way, that left it in a state that, you know, those settlers who came here were able to live on it and take what they needed. And our ways sort of got put aside for a number of years, hundreds of years. And we're at a point right now where many industries and provinces are now looking to Indigenous people for guidance on how do we fix this mess that we've made here. And so I think part of reconciliation is inviting that knowledge into whatever aspect of your life that you can, and embracing that and seeking out that alternative perspective, that Indigenous worldview, which is different from, not better than, but different from the Western worldview. And they can work together. But it's time that that Indigenous perspective has a voice.
Well,
So, miigwech, thank you.
one point that I thought would be worth making at this point too is the relationship of women to the land, because women share in the life-giving powers of the earth. And it's not only the fish and the animals that are going to get sick when things are not going right on the land or in the water. Women are also the primary indicators of the health of this entire system that we are walking around in. So in some regards, it starts to be about holding women in a higher esteem, not only because they're half of the population and they're the mums of the other half. That's a good enough reason all by itself. But the other reason is that they share, and they're much closer connected to the web of life than what guys are. And I think that's worth repeating and saying and echoing again and again to say that this is something that we can't get lost, because anything that starts to go wrong within the environment, probably the first places it's going to show up is going to be in this particular half of the population, because their biology is so much closer to the earth.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. It's definitely changed me today and how I look at society. But like, so I'm in like the social service worker program. What would you like to see from social workers, from social service workers, like in the community? Like what would support that path towards taking like another step forward towards more truth or uncovered truth? I don't know if that's a loaded question, but
I think right now the science has actually contributed to a much stronger understanding of the biologies we're gifted with. The relationship of our physiology to the harms that we experience. What is trauma? I think science is now is on the eve of saying, wow, this is this is really how humans experience stuff. This is how they remember stuff. This is the types of long harms that come with this, and what are the types of remedies that are needed in order to remove those harms from people. And all of this understanding is just now starting to emerge. They're now able to know that when someone is talking about their trauma, their loss, that at least they're able to see all this brain activity starts to really take off. And just when they get to that moment of saying, and this is what he did to me, and this is what happened to me, and then their voice starts to crack, and they start to cry, and they start to break down, that the speech center of the brain goes offline. They're not able to talk anymore. So what in fact is happening is that they're sitting there re-experiencing the harm that happened to them, because they have never been able to get to the point to be able to give voice and expression to those harms that they experience, and that's preventing them from getting well. And they have to get to that point and get it out there so they can tell their story, and tell their story again, and tell their story, and then finally realize it's only a memory. It's just a memory. It's a bad memory. It's a terrible memory. It never should have happened to me. But in the end, it's just a memory. And because it is a memory, I now have the choice that that memory is actually not going to serve me, my survival. It's not going to make me happier in the future. I'm just so glad that I found out that it is just a memory, and I can start to not let it be the filter in terms of how I experience life, how I develop other relationships with other people. All that information is just now starting to come into its own recognition, into its, and it adds a tremendous awareness in terms of how human interactions are so important. Somebody can experience something really bad, but they have a circle of people around them. They can work through that if they have someone to process that with. If they're able to develop that level of trust where they can talk about that stuff, then that really contributes a whole bunch to their mental well-being, their emotional development, their outlook on relationships, how to maintain those relationships. All of that is now much more understandable, you know. So that would be with the social worker type of stuff, that this is the human biology that needs to be some of these educational goals, I guess, that can now start to be inserted into these learning curves.
Trauma-centered care with communities, with individuals.
Yeah, even if you may not ever even use those types of things. Like, one of the things about working in a treatment center was that really easy question, like, who cooks for you at home? Who does the shopping? Who makes the rules? Who enforces the rules? All of those types of things start to give insight into the beginnings of their story, and who's at home, and how together is home, and all those types of things start to have more relevance. And you're still not talking about trauma yet. You're just kind of like, you're getting an idea of the backdrop that they're coming out of. Anyways, I'm running out of steam, folks. So if there's yeah.
You know, Eric, like, I just want one thing. First of all, I wanted to just say thank you, because every single time I listen to you speak, it's like, hey, a bunch of new information. The next time I listen to you speak, another bunch of information. And the next time I listen to you to speak, scientific information. It's like you're like a bag of mysteries that keeps giving out information, like one after the other. And I've been in this space for a really long time, and whenever I see you speak in front of a crowd, it's like blows my mind. And listening to everything that happened, like that, everything that was in the slides and everything that you said, funny how I can kind of relate that to this movie Avatar, because let me say this first, because you might be wondering, what is this guy talking about? So in that movie, basically what happens is there's this species that's really connected with Mother Nature, with Earth, and they live with spirits. Everything that they do is with the nature. They are one with the nature. And then there are the humans who comes and basically destroys everything. Why? It's because they wanted the natural resources in the ground. That kind of sounds similar. That kind of sounds relatable, right? That's exactly what happened. And on a previous day, we had this conversation about how the indigenous people, they were perfect the way that they were. And when the word system was introduced, everything started changing. And at that point, I kind of told this story. One thing that I'm pretty sure all of us can relate to is if you're used to doing the dishes at home, and when you decide, when you think for yourself, like, okay, you know what, I'm going to do the dishes tonight, and then your mom or dad says, you go do the dishes, then you no longer want to do the dishes, right? So I think it's kind of like the same reality when it comes to a society, because to a society that wasn't governed by rules and regulations and by force, people, they knew how to live, they knew how to exist. When you think about the barter system, the barter system had its fair share of pros and cons. But then again, people didn't give a price tag for being nice and helping each other out. And when you think about the indigenous way, it's all about how to help each other out, and how we give something to the nature, the nature gives something to us. And that transaction was always a thing where we, as humans, we respected the nature, we took care of the nature. We weren't destroying the nature and giving a price tag to every single thing. And Eric, when you mentioned that when the system came, they started giving values for every single thing, and maybe they didn't value enough the medicinal plants that is supposed to be valued in a way that they didn't know that the indigenous cultures, that those medicinal plants actually had so much of value. Because where I come from, even in Sri Lanka, the indigenous medicine is 1,000,000 times better than the Western medicine, which I believe is the same over here. Because when it comes to tea, people pay a lot to drink organic tea now, while food is actually supposed to be organic, not what it is right now. So when it comes to truth and reconciliation, it kind of bugged me that this incident happened very recently back in Montreal, when I was talking about, I actually went for work to Montreal for an event, and I was having this conversation with a person, how the indigenous culture is undervalued, and things that happen to them, it's not been spoken enough. And I was speaking about how, because one fact that I remember was the residential school issue went on for over a century. As I recall, it's from the 1880s till the 1990s, as I recall. Like I said, I'm sorry if my facts are wrong, but it went over a century. And it's basically cutting off the roots, right? A lot of people, they got disconnected from their families. They were in schools which were brainwashing them. And we humans, we like to take pride in our culture and in what our parent. Basically, we were born with our parents' belief and their physique, right? So unless we are exposed to that culture and that nature and that way of growth, we will be growing in the way that the society want us to be. So basically that's what they disconnected the children from. And when I was having this conversation, there was this person who said, you know what, it's just all an act, and they just want to be seen. And I wish if I could have chosen violence, because I really don't want to say the exact same things that he said, because it kind of pisses me off, because me being a person who is new to Canada, I honestly, I've spent a lot of time in this space that we all are in right now. And when I heard about residential school, residential mush, and about the history that the Indigenous people had to go through, it brings rage into me, because I wish if people were more aware about this, because nobody has to go through it, And on this day of truth and reconciliation, thank you so much, Eric, for spreading all this knowledge and awareness. I know for a fact that this has been live streamed, so I hope that a lot more people will start to see these things the way that it's supposed to be. And I hope that people will stop throwing shade and saying things that they're not supposed to be, because if anyone is being given the proper awareness about this, I hope that they'll be able to see the truth and give the truth a second chance, because the word truth didn't get the first chance it deserves. So once again, I'll give the mic over to you by saying thank you, Eric. Thanks a lot.
So just thank you for that. Again, these ideas and these concepts, they're not mine. These are from 1,000 conversations and people who are really gifted with the perception and took the time to say, hey, what about this? I also want to give another shout out to my wife, because she really, I started off by saying that, but I also say it again, is that, you get two people and they bring that light, and you hold it up to the picture in a dark room, and then that light gets a little bit bigger. You're able to see more details. You get 3 or 4 people able to talk and put their ideas together. That light gets even bigger, and you're able to see more of the picture was there. And pretty soon you're able to see the entire story of what's happened and what brought us to this time and this place, and what page of history that all of us are standing on it right now. And it's a very important time that we're in. And the stakes couldn't be higher, because the children are, if we can't come together and we can't find the resolve, then we're just passing those problems right back onto them. And they're going to even have less time and less resources to work with to find a solution. So again, it's just kind of like, it's not really me. I'm just kind of like a messenger of some sort, and just kind of like, now that we know, we can't unknow. We kind of have to do something with it now. And even if that is just echoing these things and echoing them again, and somehow making the children that are coming to know, to say, we must make sure of it. That's where our responsibilities are, is to make sure that the other people around us know, to say, there's something, there's another way up, and there's another way out. And we just have to really look and hear and see each other. Anyways, thanks for coming. Thank you. Yeah, I can relax now. I'll give you back your thing. There you go.
Eric, that was so wonderful. That was amazing. You did so great.